We're going to get started. Thank you for coming to this panel on O'Connor and genre. We have three presenters. I'm Robert Donahue, will be chairing the session. John will be starting us off, and Eugenie will go next, and I'll do a paper at the end. If you want to know anything more about us, you're welcome to look at our bios in the program or invite us out to a very expensive meal. And we'll be glad to talk to you. So with that as prologue, John.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and stand up and use our wonderful technological facilities over here that they have so kindly provided us with. So the good thing about being a poet is you begin to develop sort of a sixth sense about other people who are also poets. It's like being a teacher or being a nurse. You know, when you climb onto the airplane and other people are filtering in, you begin to say, I bet that person is a teacher. I bet that person is a nurse. I bet that person is a whatever. And most of the time you're right. Such was the case with me and Flannery. I am a high school teacher, and I had been teaching her short stories for a number of years. And every time I taught a story, whether it was Good Country People or Everything That Rises Must Converge, or whether it was, you know, maybe one of her lesser known pieces, every time her lyricism stood out to me, and a number of other traits and qualities and characteristics that normally go with poets really spoke to me. And I thought, I just wonder if we're missing something. I wonder if perhaps there's more poetry to Flannery than what we have previously thought. And so to answer that question, I was fortunate enough to go to Milledgeville in the summer of 2023, where I was able to do some research into strictly her poetry. And what you're about to see today is the culmination of that period of research, along with some other independent studies that accompanied it. So to begin with, let's talk about Flannery when she was an adult and what her perception of poetry was. I think a lot of you probably already know this top quote, right? Poetry is a nasty habit for a fiction writer to get into. This is what she's famous for, and this was in a letter to Robert and Sally Fitzgerald. However, that being said, she also entered the Georgia Poetry Society contest and won its $50 prize. So, you know, a little bit of hypocrisy there, Flannery. She did also occasionally submit poems for publication, according to the habit of being. And so when you take all of this into context with all the other pieces, one of the things that you begin to understand is that while she gave a lot of lip service to fiction, and while she sometimes disparaged poetry, that didn't really prevent her from writing. She also had a habit of complimenting her friends who had poetic ability, but she didn't really see it particularly as her genre. And of course, there are letters that indicate that as well. So now that we have kind of a broad overview of her approach as an adult, we're going to backtrack, and we're going to go to Flannery as a child. When Flannery was very small, if you go to her home in Savannah, they will tell you about the books that she was exposed to when she was a very little girl. And these books often included things like Mother Goose, A Child's Garden of Verses, rhyming books of various degrees. And of course, all of these had a very fundamental effect on her sense of sound and on her real understanding of the English language and its dynamics and its characteristics. And so this is where we begin. Even today, of course, we're finding out that whenever we read to a child, the effect of that is profound in ways that are almost spiritual. And the same could be said of Flannery. There was a study that was recently done about millennial parents. And millennial parents now are stepping away from reading to their children because they say, this is boring. We don't enjoy reading aloud to our children. And there are educational psychologists and there are experts in the field who are very concerned about what the impact of that might be. That was not the case for Flannery. Say what we will about Regina. There was a lot of reading that happened, and a lot of that reading was, in fact, poetry. When we look at the Juvenilia collection, which some of you saw earlier during the death talk, One of the things we find is that oftentimes as a child and even as a teenager, Flannery would often write poems for things like Valentine's Day, Father's Day. You saw the extensive birthday card she made her father about, how to turn 80 and still go to heaven, right? I'm butchering the title, of course, but that's all right. I would like to point out here a quick contrast. The one on the left is to her father, right, who was the fire commander. Mr. Commander, we wish to say a very happy Father's Day in every possible way you can. We hope you'll be a happy man. You hear that rhyme? You hear that meter? Of course. We send you good wishes and special good cheer. And if we had it, a bottle of beer. All right. And how was the Legion when Johnny marched home? That no more would he feel war in the zone. And then you see her edits down here at the bottom, which have been a little bit cut off. She had this original draft, so hurry up and march on home. And here you'll hear Happy Father's Day in, we can assume that word also rhymed, right? But you can see that she's made some edits. The reason I want to start with this one is because I want to contrast the feeling and the depth and the affection in this one with the one that is over here on the right. Is there a way we can move that black box?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I have to know this.
Yeah, no worries. This is the one that is to her mother. And you're about to see a great disparity between these two approaches.
Okay, it won't let me while your slides are open, unfortunately. I can minimize it though.
Okay. That'll work. All right. And we can see this now. All right. So for those of you in the back, dear madam, as I am out of ready cash, I trust this present ain't too rash. Although I believe it's what is brought, you'll have to be contented with the thought. To her mother, right? This was a birthday gift to her mother. And I don't think I need to say too much else about that. We hear the difference, we hear the contrast between her modus operandi when writing to her father and that when she was writing to her mother on very similar occasions. Let's keep going. Flannery, of course, then becomes the student poet, and we see her trend toward formalism continuing. She loves iambic pentameter. Why does she love iambic pentameter? Because, contrary to some reports, she did a lot of reading of the British Romantics, Coleridge, Blake, Wordsworth, and the names you see down here, American Romantics as well. Hawthorne, we know, who was a big influence of hers. Lots and lots of research indicating this is the case. Also Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, she had a good deal of admiration for him and his work as well. And because of this admiration, a lot of her poetry tends to lend itself toward this degree of formalism, where you have the strong iambic pentameter or other established meters, like what you saw this morning, that Emily Dickinson type meter that she used for her father's large birthday card. She favored the Shakespearean sonnet form, according to the records that were available. And also, if we could go down here to this very last point that you see there, the literary seminar at Georgia State College for Women emphasized the contrast of the English Romantics with contemporary American voices of that time, including, but not limited to, William Butler Yeats, Robert Frost. And I thought it was kind of interesting that in this course, there were no women, even though they're talking about this contrast of romantics and contemporary American voices. There's just an awful lot of male dominance, which would have been the trend for the time, but by the same token, who is Flannery going to really look to? Who is she exposed to, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about her college years here for just a minute. As I'm moving on, I want to be mindful of our time. Subject matter and issues that she often wrote about in her poems included things like haughty professors, which you'll see here in just a minute. She pokes fun at some of these in a poem entitled Higher Education, which was published in the Corinthian, the literary journal of at that time, Georgia State College for Women. We have an ode to spring, which it could also be construed as parody. She's still using that biting satire. She's still using those comic elements to kind of dig her claws into certain people and into certain ideas. More on that in just a minute. We also have some philosophical works. We have one called The Crescent, which actually appears a few times. It's in both the college magazine and then also anthologized nationally. It first appeared under a different title. Again, you'll see that in just a moment. Also, short little lyric verses that are intended to fill space in the Corinthian. These are lighthearted, sort of Edgar Guest style poems. And yet, here again, Flannery, she expresses disdain of Guest's work in later writings of hers. It's like, oh, well, these are just these little trivial poems. Well, you kind of did the same thing yourself, so we can't throw that rock too far. Anyway, also, you probably recall, Flannery originally went to college to pursue journalism, or she was going to be a journalism major. And this did have some influence on her poetry. To start with, the brevity, the conciseness that you see in her poems is often remarkable. It is true that there are times when she hedges toward the romantic tendency of lofty language, but by and large, she keeps it to the point. She also has a certain stylistic adherence, right? Capitalization and punctuation follow the Georgia State College for Women Style Guide for Journalism Students handout, which of course is still located even to this day in the Georgia College Special Collections. So even though she's experimenting with poetry, we still see this desire of hers to find structure and to find order and to find discipline and to keep things in such a manner that they seem to be rather fenced in or provided with a boundary. And that's also not necessarily a romantic tendency, but it is a tendency of the classical poets as well. She tries to avoid cliches and common figures of speech thanks to a handout she was also given. And then also some of her poems imitate the inverted pyramid style, which is explained here on this slide, which some of you probably already know about. Very old school journalistic approach. You start with the most important thing and work your way down to the least important. We'll talk a little bit about her annotations. Again, I want to be mindful of our time here. Blake and Coleridge, the English Romantic, she noticed and would often point out their use of rhyme and meter in her own classroom annotations. When she was annotating London by Blake, appropriately enough, she points out its flowing literary parallelism. And the same thing is true with The Tiger by Blake. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand bride, dare frame thy fearful symmetry. She loved that, I love that, you can tell. Yeah. Coleridge's Kubla Khan, she notices and remarks about the invented language that Coleridge uses and begins to adopt a little bit of that in her own writing as well. There's less annotating on poems by Frost and Yeats, largely corrective marks. She decided to correct the capitalization of some of America's greatest poets, which here again, considering her spelling. And of course, this comes from the source you see here. All right, so from her annotations, we go to her own work. This is the crescent that I was speaking about before. Not going to read this whole thing because it's going to consume some time. But you see here, just from the format of this poem, the emphasis on things like meter, the emphasis on rhyme, the emphasis on structure, and again, formalism demonstrated throughout. This is the piece that later on becomes included in the anthology and gains a little bit of traction with an audience. Now, what's funny about this is a different version, an earlier version of that same kind of lofty poem that had transcendental qualities. And in this case, it's actually kind of this scornful, I guess you might call scolding sort of poem. If you're wondering about this title and if it stands for anything, no, that is literally just the onomatopoeia. And then we have this, right? It's essentially cynicism and skepticism at its peak. when you look at this, when you read it, right? And even though it has, again, the lofty language of the Victorian writers or the Romantics, nonetheless, what you see here is kind of this sardonic look at things that others may consider high-minded. And we know that Flannery was often a fan of skewering that which was supposed to be high-minded. This is effervescence. We are not reading the whole thing here again. You're welcome. But one of the things that's happening here is as you read through this, you see that she has a good amount of language in here that is intended to critique certain student groups, the waves in particular, right? The waves being female military auxiliary members, right? The soft melody of wave voices gently purring, hook, 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 2, 3, 4, hook. Yeah, enough, right? We get it. And then over here, right? Young ladies swathed in rods of flounced white cheesecloth floating about like delicate P-38s. You can't make that up, right? What's picturesque? She says. Anyway, obviously satirical, obviously, you know, kind of skewering college culture, and especially that of young women who she feels are entirely too conformist. Here's the higher education poem that I promised you earlier. Professors internally cushioned, sporting eyedroppers of self-appraised hell at random, and occasionally refilling at any commodious well. Young ladies upholstered in plaid, alphabetically placed in the room, fingers stuck deep in their ears, sounding the depth of the boom. This is Flannery at her finest, right? Even when using her biting, sarcastic wit, she opts toward formalism. She gives us more rhyme, more meter, and doesn't hold back. Again, not reading all of these. These are some of the pieces that she used for her grad school application. The Emory University Archives had these on file. These pieces that you see here are from her University of Wisconsin application and others. And some of these are renderings of earlier pieces, and others aren't new. But this is further evidence of her desire to write poetry, among other things. Now, I promised you fugitives. Here's how all of that comes to play. We know the fugitives were at Iowa when she was at Iowa. Robert Penn Warren, his annotations of O'Connor's poetry encouraged her use of formalist technique, especially rhyme and meter. Alan Tate, according to an article by Jeff Folks from 1985, Tate was an admirer of Keats and Matthew Arnold, among other Victorians, and his comments on O'Connor's works likewise indicate praise of that formalist bent we've been talking about. Finally, John Crow Ransom. This one is a little less verifiable, but there are stories that persist about Ransom urging O'Connor to develop herself as a poet. Why? Because he was a poet, he loved poetry, and of course he would. It's safe to say that all fugitive poets had a healthy respect for the British Romantics, and their comments on O'Connor's work show that. All right, so that takes us up to today. Flannery's poetic influence. Now, right over there, I kind of hope Angela would be here, but that's okay. Angela Lima O'Donnell, Andalusian Hours, right? Poems from the porch of Flannery O'Connor, and written in her voice, written in her song. So even though we have these somewhat less exalted examples of O'Connor's poetry, even though that is the case, today we have her influence being felt by those who write poetry, including myself, including many others. And we see that, of course, in addition, as her example of a literary lifeline, one who did the work, did the actual getting your hands dirty with words, which is important even today. This is Flannery's poetry, and I think that this is pretty much all we need from that, and I will hand it over to our next presenter.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So my session is an excerpt from my novel in progress, which is called Three Flowers. And my narrator is a Tamilian Brahmin woman who goes to Iowa City in 1975 to do her MA in English literature. And she is deeply influenced. I think I'm going to stand because I can't, anyway, there's no mic. Because she is deeply influenced by Flannery O'Connor, who studied in Iowa City, as we all know, from 1945 to 1948. And she writes, she's sort of isolated, she's alone, and she writes these Dear Flannery letters. The novel is also a story of obsessive love, her love for Richard and her conflict with duty and obligation, and filial duty. So at this particular scene that I'm going to be reading, it's at Memorial Hill Cemetery. In 1977, she's finished with her master's. She's all set to go back to India. And she has this, it's either have Richard or don't have Richard. So this is the scene where, it takes place. And, Bruce Gentry, your account of your visit to the home, it's not here, but it's in another scene because I have my narrator in. So I scribbled this prayer: please God, make me a good writer, at O'Connor's grave in Memory Hill Cemetery, Milledgeville, Georgia, in the summer of 1977, my summer of love. Decades later, when Flannery's prayer journal was published, a slim white book with a facsimile of her writing, I realized that it was a prayer she herself had written in Iowa City. At the time of the visit to the cemetery, I'd been in Iowa for 2 years, my MA in English literature done, along with my duration of stay student visa. After my mother's call that my beloved father was home, I booked my one-way return ticket to Madras. Papa was home now, but he'd been hospitalized and received dialysis twice a week. Come home soon, Amma said, thinking that it was my research that was delaying me. When I called the travel agent, I could have got a ticket in 1 week, even 2, but I booked a ticket 3 weeks away for September 19th. I was sad to leave America and my friends, and overwhelmed by the thought that I may never see Richard again. The afternoon after my mother's call, Richard and I kissed for the first time on the bridge over the Eyre River. It was as if the kiss had wrought its magic in a way that words had never done. Richard said, "You've always wanted to go to Georgia and visit O'Connor's grave. I'll book the tickets. We can stay at my mother's house in Atlanta. I'll drive us to Milledgeville. It's only 1.5 hours away." In Iowa, we were always with friends. This would be just him and me. I was excited that he was introducing me to his mother. In the days that led up to our visit to Georgia, my one-way ticket to Madras sat in the dresser drawer of my apartment on Bloomington Street East, where Flannery had once lived, a living thing, speaking in a voice that I did not want to hear. If you do not act, you will lose Richard, and you will regret this for the rest of your life. You must be brave now. Was this the voice of an angel or a demon? I wasn't sure, but it was insistent and soon drowned all other voices, the voices of my parents and culture, the voice of the Vijay I knew. I decided after our kiss that I would lose my virginity in the American South, not New York or Paris or Rome or Venice or the city of love, Agra with its Taj Mahal, but a place famous for its Central State Hospital. Named at first the lunatic, idiot, and epileptic asylum that grew to have 2,000 acres, 200 buildings, and 13,000 patients, and ranked the largest mental asylum in the world. Parents threatened their children when they misbehaved with, "I'll ship you off to Milledgeville." By the 1970s, the Central State Hospital had already begun its slow decline. Some of its buildings boarded up, its windows broken glass, a spooky conclave of buildings that Richard and I had gone past. But Milledgeville was also home to Georgia State College for Women, where Flannery completed her undergraduate studies in English literature and sociology. Milledgeville was also home to Andalusia Farm, where Flannery had spent the last 14 years of her life under the care of her mother, Regina, disabled and dying of lupus, but writing most of the work that we know her for. I could not embark on the seduction I had planned in his mother's house. I suggested that we stay a night in Milledgeville instead of driving back to Atlanta that evening. Richard, entirely respectful of my culture, having heard otherwise from me, living together is not part of my culture. Marriage must come first. My parents want me to marry a Tamilian Brahmin man. Only India can be home to me. I'm my parents' only child, was oblivious of my turnaround. There's a Holiday Inn bang opposite Andalusia Farm, and I want to visit, I said. After Flannery died, her mother had moved out of the house, and it was a house of relics, everything exactly as it was in Flannery's room as she'd left. A single bed with a blue and white counterpane, desks, books, and crutches. Andalusia Farm was not yet the museum that it would later become. It's private property, Richard said. We'll trespass, I think, thinking of barbed wire and angry caretakers. Richard laughed. Hopefully we won't be accosted by a misfit lurking on the grounds. We don't want to be rolling down the hill and floating dead in the pond, as in one of her stories. Richard booked 2 rooms, an unnecessary expense. Hopefully we were in adjacent rooms and not on different ends of the hotel. It would be hard to traipse down corridors or between floors with a rope wrapped tightly around the black lace teddy that I bought specifically for the occasion. No, I would invite him to my room, pour out wine, take my first drink. It would be a day of firsts. In Decatur, the morning of our Milledgeville visit, when I emerged wearing knee-length leather boots, leather skirt that barely covered my lace panties, and a tight geranium top with a plunging cleavage that revealed the edges of a black lace wonder bra, Richard looked nonplussed. Yes, I was dressed as if I was going barbecue, though I was both a vegetarian and a teetotaler. A strong drink would be good for what I planned that night. You're dressed, Richard finally said. Flashing, I looked away from him and out at his mother's Claudia's 2 very large magnolia trees, widespread branches and dense with bottle green leaves. I'd had a dream the previous night, but the trees had advanced and swallowed up the blue clapboard house with its sloping roof and screen porch with me in it. I'd lain awake for a while after my nightmare, beset by the irrational worry that my life would turn out like Flannery's, minus the genius, of course. In the dark, I counted on my fingers and listed the ways we were exactly alike. I was an only child like her. We were both devout and prayed daily. She Catholic and me Hindu. We both studied in Iowa. We were both leaving Iowa at the age of 23. I hope to be a writer, not a great one like her, but a modest writer with a few stories and maybe a book, 1 book or 2. We both lost our first love. In Iowa, then Yaddo, Flannery loved the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Robert Bower, who thought her a saint, but fell in love with and married Elizabeth Hardway. I ended my relationship with my first love, George Matthew, because my parents had not thought him or his family suitable because they were Kerala Christians and we were Tamilian Brahmins. They would not approve of Richard, which is why I tried to keep away from him in the first place. Flannery experienced only 1 kiss on a car drive with Eric Langer, the textbook salesman who came knocking at Andalusia's door, and I'd experienced only 1 kiss on the bridge over the Eyre River. We both had a conservative demeanor. My classmates said I had a Victorian demeanor. Elizabeth Hardwick said that Flannery looked like a convent girl from the harsh plains of northern Canada. We were both outsiders. She, a Southern Catholic woman in the north, and me, a Tamilian Brahmin woman. Her Piedmont Georgian accent was so unintelligible, that her classmates followed and someone else read her stories. Fortunately, my Indian accent seemed more comprehensible. The similarities that had pleased me now worried me. Why had I dreamed such a dream on the morning of my Flannery pilgrimage, and on the day when I hoped to accomplish something as significant as losing my virginity and embarking on a night of beautiful love? Was my dream a premonition of early death or sickness, some dark fate? In Iowa, life lay before Flannery, glittering false promise, a long writing career, love and marriage. But at 25, she was diagnosed with lupus. Flannery died just 16 years after her time in Iowa at the age of 39. Would I die young, fall sick and become disabled, walk with crutches, had I lived one of my happiest periods in Iowa and not known it? Feeling still the lowering magnolia trees and flailing branches tighten around me, I thought of her father's death of lupus when she was 15. Would Appa die when I was 23? Why had I delayed returning? Would he die before I returned? Would the fates deny me love, marriage, and children? In the morning light, the magnolia trees looked ordinary, and the fears of the night receded. I imagined Richard and I returning one spring with our first child to visit when the magnolia trees were bloom with flowers, its white flowers, its scent dizzying. Richard put on his dark glasses, strong jaw, tall, broad-shouldered, handsome, and his short sleeve light brown shirt and cotton flared pants. Every inch of him was delectable, and in all our time together in Iowa City, I had touched, caressed, let alone kissed, almost none of it. Never again, for all my loving, would a man have such an effect on me. His singular impression on my consciousness, akin to Flannery's presence in Iowa City, as a sister of faith and as an extraordinary writer. Even as I wrote Dear Flannery letters in my journal, I imagined her writing back to me with the same enthusiasm, openness, and love with which she addressed Betty Hester and Myriad. Admittedly, the Memorial Hill Cemetery was a strange place to choose to do unflattering-like, but in some ways it felt right. Here were the graves on either side, maybe 5,000 or 6,000, the grackles with their long tails and iridescent long plumage of bronze, purple, and azure didn't sing the dharma of the Buddha's teachings, or for all the statues of Jesus and Mary and angels and cherubs didn't pour the sins of the flesh. It was marvelous, witty poetry they spoke of in high-pitched guttural voices. The graves a fine and private place, and none, I think, to their embrace. She's here, I gasped, as I hurried out of the white-covered portico at Memorial Hill Cemetery towards Richard, a wasp buzzing dangerously close to me, waving a brochure listing famous people that were buried. O'Connor being one of them. 4 years earlier, Flannery had posthumously won the National Book Award for her collection of stories. I said she's here, as if O'Connor was here, standing beneath the cloudless, bright blue sky, sweating a little as I was beneath the Georgia sun, in her knee-length cotton dress and sturdy shoes, her face covered with cortisone, her skin smudged with a butterfly rash, squinting a little behind horn-rimmed spectacles, stepping forward using her crutches. Where, Richard said, shutting the door of his ice blue Chevrolet and turning toward me. It seemed that every time he did something as simple as turn, it was a kaleidoscope. It was as if a kaleidoscope moved, and the landscape turned mystical, seductive, and very, very bright, its colors dazzling, unforgettable. A tunnel of prism of light that would be with me even in my death, accompanying me from this world to the next, as if there is a next. I breathed and also casually touched his arm. Section A, Block 39, Grave 7. Leading the way, I took the first path to the left, stumbling forward awkwardly in my boots. The leather was hot against my calves. Earlier that day in the shower, I had scrubbed myself with Yardley soap and then sprayed myself with Dior. Places that I imagined Richard would kiss, and now I was sweating profusely in the heat, that I could smell myself. Velvet in this heat, I heard Flannery wryly say. Maybe dressing like this was a horrible mistake, but it was too late now. Hurrying up at the path by section A, I knew that though she loved Robert Lowell in Iowa and Leonard Yaro and lost him to the elegant Elizabeth Hardwick, she would never have turned siren to Susan. I hope too that Flannery didn't know what Eric said in an interview after her death, that kissing her was like kissing a corpse. Death was so near. How much do the dead know, if they know at all? So, in the roll of graves most identifiable and some with no markers or names, Flannery waited for us on the east side. And though I didn't feel it proper to ask for her help, I did anyway. As clear as his path towards losing my virginity was to me, I was in uncharted territory. I would be encountering a woman I did not know, this other Vichy. Like Flannery and Richard, I weigh the consequences of my actions and endeavor to live a good life, consonant with my values drawn from my culture, religion, and philosophy, including the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy of Stoicism that Richard had introduced me to when he gave me a present of the Stoic Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. No more of all this talk about what a good man should be, but simply be one. For desperate times, call for desperate measures. All day I will say this as if counting the 108 beats of a Japa mala. Stumbling through the realities of my life in Memorial Hill Cemetery, I was at a crossroad. Was it Hecate who stood before me, the grackles circling around, speaking curses or blessings? For Flannery, wandering among the graves with Richard trailing a little behind me, I found Flannery's grey slab by the far end of the wall, close to the road and across from the church. Mary Flannery O'Connor, daughter of Regina Lucer Klein and Edward Francis O'Connor Jr., born in Savannah, Georgia, March 25th, 1925, died in Milledgeville, Georgia, August 3rd, 1964. They were offerings on the grave, a pen, shell, coins, and a bouquet of red roses. The cellophane was dirty with mud and rain, and the flowers had drooping heads. Her father, Edward, was buried by her. As I knelt by her grave, I imagined Flannery saying, "Vichy, such desperation is not rational. The Stoics valued reason, primarily living according to nature. But I needed to sweep Richard forward with the force of our love, propose, and declare that he would return to India with me. The sex would result in marriage and children in Madras, and the life I dreamed of and felt I would die without." As Richard wandered away, giving me privacy, I sat awkwardly on the ground. The sun was bright. It was a hot Georgia summer. And though trees lined the path through the cemetery, there were no trees between the graves. "Richard's no Bible salesman," I said to Flannery. "He's good like Lowell and more stable. Of course, neither of us have Lowell or your genius. We are ordinary lovers." I reached into my purse and tore out a page from my notebook. It was then that I wrote the prayer, "Please God, make me a good writer." I prefaced my prayer with another graveside Flannery letter. "Dear Flannery, thank you for your writing. I believe I felt your presence with me in Iowa. Love, Richard." When Richard returned, my letter to Flannery was folded tightly, as if I were pushing it through a slot. I placed a small stone over it and found a single white silk lily on the ground and placed it on top. Perhaps the lily was from a bouquet someone had bought her, or maybe it was from some other grave and the wind had brought it here. I remained sitting seductively and awkwardly at the foot of Flannery's grave, breast popping, wonder bra and all, hair freshly washed and falling down my shoulders, and my legs spread out a little, and panties most certainly visible. Surveying Flannery's grave, Richard spoke the words of Marcus Aurelius. "Every part of me will change into another part of the world, and then it will change again and again, and so on to infinity." All I knew as the grackles sang the chorus for this play, a tragedy or a comedy, was my sorrow at leaving America and Richard. If home was India, home was now also where he lived. I did not want to live a life without Richard. I did not know how, like Flannery knew how, not to make love everything to me. I felt love's sorrow and fear pulsing beneath my skin. Richard held out his hand to help me stand. I turned over and looked at his broad palm, the lifeline long and curved. Was I in his hand, in his fate, or was it just this one summer? I kissed his palm, my lips lingering and trailing a line from palm to wrist. The gray slab was a bed where I considered laying down with my knees raised under the cloudless blue Georgia sky, alive, unlike my sister, not yet dead. 25th March 1925, the day Flannery was born, was the feast of the Annunciation. There must have been something of destiny in that auspicious coincidence and in the work that she would do in our world. I too was born on the day of the goddess Lakshmi, but so far I had done little. I decided then that if I didn't get pregnant, lying would be my next recourse. I'm pregnant, I would say. I almost spoke my thoughts aloud, and if I had, Richard would have been startled. It would have been immaculate conception, the feast of the Annunciation, the day the angel Gabriel visited a young woman from Galilee to tell her that she would be Theotokos, mother of God. Last night, after my nightmare of carnivore magnolia trees, my plan that had begun with the decision to make love had turned into something larger. My plan was unethical. No, it was simply a trick. Not novel in any way, not particularly evil, but an old story. I remembered my father's account of a friend in the UK who was forced to marry a fellow medical resident student who had cared for him when he was sick and then seduced him. She said she was pregnant when she was not. She concocted a miscarriage after they married, but later they had children and remained happily or unhappily married. He didn't know. If that feckless medical student had done the right thing, surely Richard, with all his devotion to philosophy, would. Last page. Sorry. Unlike the Virgin, there was no annunciation in my destiny. I would carry not God, but my child with Richard, born of such love that the child would swim in it, held afloat in a divine ocean of Krishna bliss. Yet such divine analogies felt dissonant, considering what I had planned. If I didn't get pregnant and said I was, trickery is not consonant with my virtue ethics. What the ancient Greco-Roman Stoics affirm, virtue is the only true law. Richard pulled me up, slipping his arms around my waist, pulling me to him. I could feel him against me and was exultant. I snuggled in. Richie, you're so beautiful. I need you so much. This visit to Milledgeville was stained glass in the mosaic of my life. Yes, I would get pregnant. The time was right. I was possibly ovulating. I would not have to lie. If I did have to lie, I vowed that this would be the only lie I would tell in my otherwise virtuous life. There would be no more lies, no more aberrations in the path of everyday virtue. Tonight at the Holiday Inn, across from Andalusia, Flannery's blessing overshadowing me like a sacred cloud. Richard would say, "Richie, will you marry me?" Yes, I will return to India with him. In return, I would sing the words of the Tamil Sangam poem to the accompaniment of Mirabai's Eyre, the lute. But in love, our hearts are as red earth and pouring rain, mingled beyond pardon.
Maybe you're helping to get the point out. Oh, we had this slight technical moment. Two things I would say in preface to this paper. Number one is I'm very grateful for a wife who takes care of my technological deficiencies. It helps me out a lot. This is my wife, Ann. She's here with me. The second thing is just a word of warning. I've been living in Texas now for 35 years. My French pronunciation is going to be a little bit off because that's our Texas tradition. We take words that are fine in their home language and we make them something brand new. And I promise that's what you're going to hear today as I read my paper entitled O'Connor and the Art of George Rouault. The distance between Flannery O'Connor's bedroom and typewriter at Andalusia in George Rouault's apartment and studio near Gare de Lyon includes not just miles, but media and languages. It's not surprising, therefore, that Rouault, born in 1871 and dead by 1958, while O'Connor was in the middle of her writing career, seems to have been unaware of this regional American writer. O'Connor, on the other hand, was very much aware of him and of his work. This awareness bubbles to the surface in 4 letters mentioning Rouault, the earliest to Betty Hester dated December 28, 1951, where she references a book, some of it unnamed, some of whose illustrations remind me, quote, of Henri Rousseau, son of the Christ of Rouault. Less than a year later, in another letter to Betty Hester, she writes, O'Connor complains about the art theories of a father's seed by referencing Rouault. If he said anything about Rouault not being a good religious artist, he's pure nuts. 2 additional letters to Janet McCain, both written in the 1960s, reference Rouault. The last one mentioning a specific, if unnamed, work that O'Connor claims to have seen. Quote, the one of Christ standing at the boats with the sun in it. Most likely Rouault's Christ and the Fisherman. At the same time, Catherine Laborde's recent book, Flannery O'Connor's Manhattan, places O'Connor's visits to New York museums in the period of the 1940s, when both the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art were exhibiting Rouault's work, including a major MoMA exhibit in 1945. Nevertheless, without archival work in these New York museums and a little additional biographical information, scholars can only speculate what Rouault paintings or works O'Connor saw. My original plan for this paper was to pull on some of these threads with references to O'Connor's writing, but time and funding limitations put that beyond my reach. Instead, I hope to show the affinity between both the techniques and the ideas that shape these 2 artists. Links offering fresh insights into O'Connor's last story, Parker's Back. At the affective level, both of these mature arts aim at audience shock, a move that surprisingly may have come to them from the same source. Rouault began his career training and working with Gustave Moreau, producing paintings of religious subjects in a style derived from Rembrandt and the Old Masters. That style is exemplified by the 2 paintings that you see on the slide. Infant Jesus Among the Doctors and his 1895, The Dead Christ Mourned by the Holy Women. But following Moreau's death, his subject matter changed. Rouault writes, I had a moment of madness. This is my favorite French word I learned in this whole process. It's coup de folie. I've had lots of those. I just didn't know what they were. I had a moment of madness or grace, depending on the angle of view. The face of the world changed. And if it's not too pretentious to speak that way, then I saw everything I saw earlier, but in another form, another harmony. Virginia Reinberg describes the change this way. After 1902, Rouault's art turned from religious narratives painted in the Rembrandt-esque style toward circus figures, prostitutes, and the face of Christ expressed in the modern idiom. According to Rouault's great-grandson, much of the impetus for this change came from reading Leon Blau's novel, The Poor Woman. I'll save you the French pronunciation of the time. O'Connor had a similarly impactful encounter with Blau, writing early in her career, with Blau's writing early in her career. Writing in her prayer journal in May of 1947, O'Connor relates, Blau has come my way. The awful thing is, we can go back to ourselves after reading it. He is an iceberg hurled at me to break up my Titanic. And I hope my Titanic will be smashed. But I'm afraid it takes more than blood to destroy the age in us. These modern Christ, pictured on war posters and in poems, every man is Jesus, every woman Mary, would make blah wretch. The rest of us have lost the power to vomit. And O'Connor would spend much of her writing trying to resurrect in her readers this power to vomit. A sense of outrage and anguish lies at the heart of one of her most famous dictums. Quote, you have to have your vision, you have to make your vision apparent by shot. For the hard of hearing you shout, for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. For both O'Connor and Rouault, the encounter with Blaw's writing prodded them toward a faith that linked faith with poverty and suffering. A shot for generations accustomed to wrapping religion in material comforts. This kind of startling break from tradition is reflected in their shared techniques of etching and impasto. Rouault, of course, was well known for his prints collected in book form, especially Miserere, which he worked on from 1912 to 1948. Designs that he created and then engraved on copper plates. But his painting creates a sense of depth similar to the prints by what Jean-Marie Teza describes as, quote, a process of sedimentation, a material density and richness. He labored on his impasto just as fire works on clay and enamel. And he spoke of burning lava and interior fire that simmered in his paintings. In O'Connor's own paintings, impasto is one of her frequent techniques. Frequent enough for O'Connor to weave it into a humorous anecdote about her family in a letter to Sally Fitzgerald. Sister says she doesn't like modern art because it's not smooched down. My mama says it's not modern art, insulted. It's very true to nature, and there's no use spending 5 hours on a painting you can do in 2. This refers to the fact that I had been painting with a palette knife because I didn't like to wash the brushes. But impasto, generally defined as a technique in which the artist adds layers to a work for a 3-dimensional effect, may also be a way to think about O'Connor's writing process, her habits of revision. Again and again, she returned to the text of her stories to add layers of meaning and depth to the work. Something even her cursory look at the geranium, her first published story, in its final version, Judgment Day, one of her last, reveals. Yet perhaps the most interesting overlap between these two artists is their presentation of Christ in their mature works. In a very important essay called The Stark Relation of Seeing the Thing as It Is, Stephen Schlosser offers a reading of Rouault's Miserere that has at its core triptychs and other linked works that morph images of Christ into the modern world. For instance, he links the images and titles of plates 2, 3, and 4. Plate 2, Jesus reviled. Plate 3, forever scourged. And plate 4, takes refuge in your heart, vagabond of misfortune. And Schlosser believes there should be ellipses between those to tie these into one coherent sentence. And you can see how they certainly make sense. The 2 New Testament images are linked to a modern vagabond, a vagabond of misfortune. Literally in French, and I'll try this one, so just hang on. Va nu pieds, going with nude feet. In telescoping these and other groupings, Schlosser argues that Rouault communicates his sense of Christ in the modern world. Christ is in the beggars and tramps and circus figures that make up much of his characteristic work. In this transformation, Rouault points to what he sees as the salvation of humans. They become Christ by recognizing his wounds in their own suffering and are healed, which Schlosser points out is the last plate of Miserere. It is by his wounds that we are healed. When Rouault, I think you can go on. I think I left an underline now. Nope, didn't. Sorry about that. But Rouault shows through visual images, O'Connor reveals through language, though literal Christ figures are largely absent from her work. As O'Connor told interviewer Gerald E. Sherry in 1963, I'm interested in the old Adam And in Pauline theology, of course, humankind is the old Adam in contrast to the new Adam, Christ. As Carol Schloss argues, discussing the displaced person, to place Christ in the story via Mr. Guzak is to mistake two beings with a common aspect as incarnations of one being. And I would add, it validates the flawed Mrs. McIntyre, person who utters the Christ DP equivalency. And I don't think that's O'Connor's goal. Like Rouault, O'Connor takes low migrant people and as they suffer, shows their development in faith. These three shared qualities, habits in my mind, of their art offer new ways for readers to read and understand the new, sometimes over-familiar aspects of O'Connor's fiction. And to take that a little deeper, let me reconnect this to specifically to Parker's Back. Now, this might seem a surprising story to read in light of Rouault and O'Connor's common ideas. After all, traditional critics, as different in distance and time as Frederick Assels and Sarah Gordon, both use a form of mellow to describe the story, not shock. It's a far cry from any sense that Rouault and O'Connor are trying to shock the audience. Yet, if the two major characters are looked at through the lens of Rouault, one begins to see where the story's shock lies. For Rouault, the women he shocked his audience with were prostitutes, generally painted in that period of 1902, 1912, and according to scholar Margaret Miles, were followed by a period focused on the sufferings of Christ. These were women who worked in the red light district where Rouault's studio was located, and whom he brought into his studio by providing them with a wood stove for heat in the Paris cold. They are far, as you can see, from pornographic beauties. Rather, despite face paint and nudity, they might well be described like Sarah Ruth as plain, or tall, raw bone. Moreover, Sarah Ruth's attention is bought by food, first a bushel of apples and then the promise of peaches. And this body bargaining is approved by Sarah Ruth's pimpish mother, quote, who did not seem to mind his attention to the girl as long as he brought a basket of something with him when he came. And of course, Sarah Ruth demands the ultimate price for sex, marriage. Quote, Parker understood why he had married her. He couldn't have got her any other way. Now, critics have described Sarah Ruth as pious and self-denying. They've ignored the shocking possibility of reading sexualized imagery in her, quote, sitting on the front porch floor, snapping beans. And at least my mom taught my sister, you never like spread your legs out apart like that, as they're doing in the bean snapping. And of course, Sarah Ruth snaps Parker's bean in the sense of putting an end to his romantic ardor several times in the story. Little shot. Here, as a Rouaultian sex worker, suggests less that O'Connor, as Gordon claims, expressed her own disapproval of Sarah Ruth and her form of spirituality, than that she views Sarah Ruth's condition with a pity due to the limitations of class and heritage. Her religious fundamentalism makes her a comically ironic villain, if she's in fact a villain at all. Using Rouault as a lens also affects views of Parker, making him a version of Rouault's circus clowns. Rouault describes his initial encounter with the clown this way. He came across, quote, a nomad caravan parked by the roadside, where he saw, quote, an old clown sitting in the corner of his caravan in the process of mending his sparkling and gaudy costume. Rouault claims he was struck by the contrast between, quote, the brilliant, scintillating objects made to amuse and a life of infinite sadness if seen from slightly above. From this experience, he concludes, quote, I saw quite clearly that the clown was me, was us, nearly all of us. This rich, glittering costume, it is given to us by life itself. We are all more or less clowns. We all wear a glittering costume. For Parker, his tattoos are the glittering costume that he tries to construct and repair into the arabesque of men and beasts and flowers that he has seen at the fair. His repairs, however, like the clown's, always break down as soon as, after each tattoo, he feels a huge dissatisfaction and goes off to find another tattooist and have another space filled up. As this description of the text suggests, Parker too is a nomad in motion on most of the pages of the story. And after he crashes his employer's tractor into her old tree, he creates a fireball that consumes his shoes, making him one who goes with nude feet. Seeing Parker as one of Rouault's clowns not only fits the general ridiculousness of his character, but it also clarifies his underlying sadness that some critics have focused on. Bruce Gentry, for instance, has seen the story steering Parker to his moment of, quote, entrance into the suffering community. But as a clown, he has been part of that community from the start, a symbol for what Rouault saw as the contrast between brilliant, sparkling things for amusement and the infinite sadness of life. But what about the Byzantine Christ tattooed on Parker's back? Most readings use it as a chance to note O'Connor's religious ideas, but awareness of Rouault's links to O'Connor encourages an additional focus on her art, especially the way she weaves the technique of impasto into the story through Parker's tattooist. He is, by the way, the only character in all of O'Connor who is called the artist. And her work is crowded with want to be and failed artists, but the artist in Parker's back is successful. He has a 2-room studio for doing his work. He can afford to be choosy in his clientele. I don't put tattoos on drunks. Parker considers him the best in town, and his work takes time. More importantly, his process resembles impasto by requiring several returns to the canvas, several additions to the depth of the paint. He starts with swabs of ethyl chloride, then uses an iodine pencil for an outline, before finally taking up the electric instrument. The work itself requires multiple color change, creating little red and blue and ivory and saffron squares, and periodic pauses to wipe the dripping dye off Parker's back as he went along. As an author, O'Connor not only returned to the story with revisions to the extent her failing body allowed. If you've not read her letters to A and her letters to Carolyn Gordon, as she's trying to revise this book, as she's literally in the process of dying, you need to hunt those up. They will chill your soul. But the story itself has a returning structure. Not only does she have this idea about returning, but the story itself has a returning structure. It opens on Parker's porch, sometime after Parker and Sarah Ruth are married, but before Parker gets his tattoo. Then it digresses in a series of flashbacks and asides to describe the couple's first meeting, Parker's childhood and leaving home, their marriage, and finally arrives at the burning tree, which launches a lengthy pilgrimage back to the porch where the story began, but now letting readers see it with more depth and understanding. With an impasto technique, O'Connor adds material, including keyholes and welts that form a 3-dimensional word, dimensions that keep us returning as readers to O'Connor's fiction. Yet the most interesting idea in Parker's back that Rouault's thought and practice help illuminate is its depiction of Christ, or I should more accurately say it's 2 depictions. When Parker is looking for a tattoo to fill the empty space on his back, the story gives us a comic and odd dialogue. Who are you interested in? The artist said. Saints? Angels? For Christ? Or what? God, Parker said. Father? Son? Just God, Parker said impatiently. Christ, I don't care. Just so it's God. But Parker seeks a God with no particular emphasis on one divine incarnation or another, suggests he is not interested in the Kyrios Pantocrator, the Lord Almighty that Ralph Wood sees as the model for his tattoo. Nor is he consciously seeking the tattoo that will return his body, as ordinary as a loaf of bread, into an arabesque in which the skin will appear to have a subtle motion of its own. Rather, he wants the tattoo to bring Sarah Ruth healing, to give them traditional male-female roles, similar to the anecdote O'Connor once told an interviewer about a connection of hers whose Baptist husband attended Mass with her on Sundays, though he didn't think the Catholic Church had much to offer. In short, He undergoes the tattooing not as part of a salvation process that most critics have focused on, but to manipulate his wife. What he gets, however, is less a talisman for sexual dominance, but initially all demanding eyes that emphasize his subservience. Such subservience aligns him with one of Rouault's favorite images from Miserere, Veronica's veil, which Stephen Schlosser calls the linchpin holding the series together. According to tradition, Veronica met Christ as he carried his cross on the way to Calvary. In compassion, she hands him her veil to wipe his face, but when he gives the veil back to her, it depicts the face of Christ. Afterwards, she continues to travel the roads, giving the veil to those she meets who are ill or afflicted as an act of compassion and mercy. And that the name Veronica means true image, Vera icon, connects her closely to Parker's tattoo and suggests what the eyes demand, compassion. A word that can be seen as illustrating his sudden desire to return, to go back to Sarah Ruth, for whom he longs miserably as he tries to sleep in the haven of light, and his realization that what he wants is not change, but to please her. This sends him, like Veronica, on the pilgrim's final road. That he fails to please her leads to the second image of Christ in the story, one that emphasizes not success, but suffering, the scourging at the pillar. And I'll repeat some of the slides I've shown you before. In Miserere, Rouault uses a triptych of images depicting the pre-crucifixion events that the Gospels cover tersely. St. John's Gospel states only, then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. In the etchings, Rouault is equally sparse. The first image of the triptych consists only of the head of Christ and has the caption, Jesus reviled. The second image is almost the full naked body of Christ with the caption, forever scourged. The third has a modern figure with a backpack and a child and is titled, Takes Refuge in Your Heart, Vagabond of Misfortune. In a sense, O'Connor uses the same triptych pattern, building her final image of Parker in 3 tight packages. 1, she grabbed up the broom and began to thrash him about the shoulders with it. Jesus reviled. Large welts had formed on the face of the tattooed Christ, forever scourged. And then there he was, who called himself Obadiah Elihu, leaning against the tree, crying like a baby. Like Rouault's art, Parker's back rejects a triumphant or even a judgmental Christ. The story emphasizes the humanity of Christ in what, in Mary Louise Roberts' view, succinctly captures Rouault's vision. A quote from Virgil's Aeneid that he attaches to an etching of Orpheus in Miserere. Sunt lacrimae rerum. There are tears of grief at the very heart of things. And with this Orpheus image, we're brought back to the artist at the heart of Parker's back, and more importantly, to the artist who wrote it. We find her in harmony with one of the best known modernist visual artists of her time, certainly the most Catholic. In seeing their connections as well as the story as well as O'Connor's Catholicism have a new slant. Fiction becomes a way to go beyond a cold belief about some past or future salvation. It shows a complex understanding of the believer's existence right now. Thank you so much. Thank you. We have time for some questions, some comments, no Rotten Tomatoes.
That's half beans.
They're snap beans. I thought that was for you, Colin. You'll never read the story the same way. Anybody? Sure, Ryan.
For John, I was struck by, I think it was your first screen there, you mentioned friends with poetic ability that Flannery encouraged. I wonder if the Arkansas poet Miller Williams is someone you've looked at in terms of their friendship or mentorship. Well, I'll summarize this briefly and get your reaction. It sounds like you're aware. He was a textbook rep he called upon Flannery O'Connor in that guise in the mid-50s, a man who had published only a few poems. Ended up that Louisiana State University hired him largely on a recommendation letter from Flannery O'Connor. And he later read at Bill Clinton's second inauguration, very, very prominent poet. But there's one quote that I'll try to paraphrase that I think touches closely on what you were talking about with genres. Apparently, their Porch Andalusia friendship developed to the point where, and I think this is in Sarah Gordon's book in Celebration of Genius, but apparently Miller Williams said to Flannery O'Connor something like, Miss O'Connor, you write poems in the guise of stories, to which Flannery politely replied, well, Mr. Williams, you seem to write poems. I may have got this wrong. You seem to write stories that are in the guise of poetry. It's much better told in Gordon's book. But what about that in terms of genre crossover or relationship there?
Yeah, Miller Williams' name actually comes up quite a bit in various archives, both at Emory and then also at Georgia College State University. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't see enough evidence there to warrant inclusion exclusively in the research presentation. But yes, absolutely. I think that's a point to be noticed, and it's certainly something. Even today, Miller Williams' legacy is huge. There's the Miller Williams Poetry Prize for the University of Arkansas Press. It was formerly judged by Billy Collins. Now they have kind of this rotation of various poets who are highly esteemed that give that series the gravitas that it has. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up.
A comment on that question and then a question for Ron Jimmy. But the comment is that Miller Williams deeply influenced another Georgian, someone else from Middle Georgia, that is, who would have celebrated his 100th birthday quite recently, and that is President Carter. President Carter studied poetry post-presidency, wrote a couple of poetry volumes, and was schooled in that in very direct ways by Miller Williams. So
I don't remember if Carter had a poet as a you think?
I don't think he did actually, but that's worth thinking about. But this was post-presidency when he was casting the ballot for various things to do, like woodworking, as well as poetry, as well as other novel writing.
I was aware those two men knew each other. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For Longini, so we've seen these various artistic genres presented today being influencing O'Connor or influencing us in ways that are mindful of O'Connor. And I know you work across genres yourself in terms of the different kinds of work that you do. And I wonder, and you know, as we now know, Flannery O'Connor had deep understandings of art as well as practiced as well as poetry. And I'm wondering how you kind of keep those genres sort of straight on your head as you're working on the memoir, novel, if I'm correct, and short stories too, right?
So yeah, I mean, I don't write poetry. I've published some bad poetry. Well, I don't really write poetry, but I do write, you know, memoir. And so the memoir and the short story in novel form, there's a lot of, I mean, there's some elements of autobiography in the novel, but then there's a lot that's completely made up. But I think it's just my interests, you know, so, you know, I work on two different things at the same time. When I feel creatively blocked, like with the novel, many times creatively blocked, then I move to the memoirs. So I work on different projects at the same time, and so my memoir and my fiction, you know, I'm interested in Stoicism, so Stoicism, I have a character in the novel who's a Stoic. I'm interested in Flannery, so she's in my memoir, which is in the novel. But and so I didn't know how, I mean, it is compartmentalized in a way that in fiction there is the focus that I have to keep up the momentum in a way that, you know, and I have to keep creating the story. But in the memoir, I have the story of my life. So in a way, memoir has been easier for me, but the self-revelation aspect of memoir is always a challenge. Thank you.
Anyone else? Sure. Can't see this far.
Yeah, so thanks to all of you for your presentations. I'm gonna stand up because I'm short. So Bob, I appreciated having these images on the screen, and I don't know much about Rouault, except that when I gave a presentation years ago on O'Connor to French nuns, they said, have you ever heard of Georges Rouault? I said, no, and they showed me, wow. And the other name they mentioned was Geneviève Galois, who was a contemporary of Rouault, the prioress of a Benedictine convent. And her paintings are very much in this style. She paints crucifixion scenes very much like this, but then instead of prostitutes, she's painting the lives of her community. So I don't know, I mean, even if you Google her, which I just did just to check, you don't find any entries in English, anything that's written on her. There are a couple of books on her, but they're in French, they're not translated. No idea if O'Connor would have been familiar, probably not, but it's just an observation. So,
No, that's-
yeah.
And you know, one of the odd things, as far as I know, and Rosemary or Bruce, you can tell me different. O'Connor did not read or speak French.
Yeah.
She did? Okay. I was under the impression that she.
Not very well.
She said. But, you know, I know she claims to have read all of Bloch at some point in her life, but she only owns 2 books. And some scholars, this is really all she read. They were both translations. One of them by Maritain's wife. So there's some great connections in there. And she would have heard about Rouault in there because Rouault was also, you know, he was a friend of Bloch's. Anybody else?
You guys said it all.
I wish. Well, thank you so much for coming. We've got another Bruce Gentry's keynote coming up in just a little while. So, Steve.